with us. Rosie Rich is volunteering with peace education at Quakers in Britain at the moment, which we're very grateful for. She's also doing her PhD into conscientious objection in the Second World War, which I'm sure you might hear a little bit about related to her topic. And I think, Rosie, if you're happy for me to share, you have a kind of personal family interest in conscientious objection. I think it was your grandfather, wasn't it, that was a conscientious objector, and you inherited some of the letters and artifacts, which I always think it's interesting how people get interested in topics. But yeah, we're lucky to have you with us, Rosie, and for you doing the Skillshare today. Thank you very much.
So, as Izzy said, my research looks at conscientious objectors in Britain during the Second World War, and I was inspired to work on this project because of my grandfather. And I'm really interested in the lived experience of conscientious objection, and also the memory of that lived experience, further down the line. So that's kind of what we're, with that in mind, you can think about my presentation now. So the first part of the presentation, I'm going to talk just a bit about my research. I mean, some of you might have some knowledge on this topic already, so apologies if I'm going over what you already know. But just introducing you to the topic, introducing you a little bit to my research. And then in the second part, we'll be looking at I'll be going over another project that I've been working on, which is about children's literature about conscientious objectors. And so that feeds more into the kind of peace education theme of the meeting. Right, okay, so first of all, what I'd like you all to do initially is just take a minute to think and then feedback about what words, phrases or events spring to mind when you think about the Second World War in Britain. So do feel free to kind of, mention anything that comes to mind.
Blitz.
The Blitz, yeah.
Evacuees.
Oh, sorry, what was that?
Evacuees.
Evacuees, yeah.
Racist Prime Minister.
Racist Prime Minister.
Prisoner.
Refugees.
Prisoner of war camps.
The Dunkirk.
Dunkirk, yeah.
Refugees.
Refugees, yes.
Internment of foreign nationals who were living in Britain, like my grandfather.
Okay, great. So thank you for those contributions. Why I've been asking is because what I'll be talking about now is the popular memory of the Second World War in Britain. And this is a theory I'm using in my research. So in Britain, the popular memory of the Second World War, I would say for the general kind of population, as the country's finest hour, is notable for its pervasiveness and durability. Popular memory theory suggests that the dominant memory of an event or period forms as a result of a struggle between different groups until a hegemonic account emerges, which generally mutes alternative interpretations. And this is significant for national identity. Popular memory is a version of the past which connects up to the present so as to produce popular conceptions of who we are, where we've come from, and why our society is as it is. This produces a national identity which is historically defined. So, Noakes has observed that in Britain, post-1945 events are frequently seen through the lens of the war, with continual references to the spirit of Dunkirk or the Blitz, which are often used interchangeably. Yeah. And can you think of any recent events that have been seen through the lens of the war? Can anyone think of any?
Brexit.
Brexit. That's definitely a key one.
Death of the Queen.
Yeah. So on this second slide, I'll show you some newspaper cuttings that I've amassed about this. So COVID-19, what we can learn from wartime efforts. That was the BBC, May 2020. An excerpt from The Guardian, May 2020. With the country in crisis and the NHS stretched to breaking point, Boris Johnson's government has seized on war rhetoric, national pride and nostalgia. And we have Brexit, The Guardian 2019, do mention the war. The politicians comparing Brexit to World War II. From Jacob Rees-Mogg to Boris Johnson, war rhetoric is never far from the Brexit debate. And then the Queen's funeral, The Telegraph, September 2022. At the Queen's funeral, the spirit of the war generation will call to us again. So the popular memory of the Second World War is significant because it has it's used for political purposes in the present, so it still has real significance. So we bring it back to conscientious objectors. So in a nation so obsessed with the Second World War, those who refuse to fight in it have no place in the popular narrative. In fact, Lindsay Robb has observed that the Second World War British conscientious objector has, to a remarkable degree, been omitted from both the popular narrative and the historiography of Britain's war experience. So when I started my research there, part of the reason I think I got funding for it and it was deemed like an important project was that there wasn't much, it was under research, not much written on the subject, and it is starting to be remedied, but it's still a gap in the research. So, is a question for you. How many conscientious objectors were there in Second World War Britain? A, 30,000, B, 16,000, C, 20,000, or D, 60,000?
60,000.
Anyone else?
20.
20?
30?
30? Okay, so we've got a range of answers there. There were actually 60,000 conscientious objectors in Second World War Britain, over 3 times the number of the First World War. This amounted to 22 in every 1,000 men called up. Britain was unique amongst the belligerent nations for not requiring a formal religious affiliation for recognition of conscience. Individuals could also claim political, humanitarian, or a mixture of motives for refusing military service. Overall, the system of conscientious objection in Britain was unique and thus constitutes a significant aspect of the country's wartime history. It deserves to be remembered. While the decision to refuse the Nazis may appear problematic to many people now, it should be viewed in context. As Cynthia Eller has observed, a decision to be a conscientious objector that seemed justified in 1940 to oppose a capitalist imperialist war, for example, may have seemed considerably less justified in 1945 as the war took on a different coloration, say as a struggle against an inhuman fascism. The intervening years have only exaggerated this tension. My research has found that, in their personal testimony, conscientious objectors are keen to place their decision to refuse to fight in the context of the interwar period. They particularly reference the legacy of the First World War, the fear of a new, more destructive war, and the interwar peace movement, the largest Britain has ever seen. And we've got a photo here of a woman selling peace news, which is obviously the PPU's kind of mouthpiece. The popular memory of the Second World War as Britain's finest hour has overshadowed and largely eclipsed the anti-war climate of the decade that preceded it. So is this a forgotten chapter of our national peace history? And here I've put together some quotes that I've from the personal testimony that I've been working with from Second World War COs. So we have John Marshall saying, well, the 1930s was a sort of emotional semi-pacifist period. Edward Blishen, who's a famous author you might have come across, saying in his autobiography, all that literature of disgust I'd read, bitter fruit of the Great War, as we'd called it till this greater war came, the horror of it, the rejection it expressed, had run in my veins until I could not think of fighting without a sense of shock. It had been horrible. They had all hated it, those chroniclers of the First World War, and one couldn't, having supped of their anger and revulsion, start it all again. If war began, I'd been very clear about this in my last year at school, one would be tempted. The flood would seek to carry one with it, but only by intolerable betrayal of all those haggard men of the First War, I thought. Only by turning one's back on Barbusse and Remarque and Sassoon could one give in. John Marshall, again, in his oral history interview with the Imperial War Museum, we assumed it, the next war, would be Armageddon, utterly and completely, almost as we now think about nuclear warfare, you see. And this interview was recorded, as you can say, in 1988. this is the point to remember, you see. It was not that we wanted to capitulate to Nazism. It wasn't that. It was that even Nazism is the lesser of two evils. David Morris, in his autobiography, said, "War was stupid and horrible. It was also useless. Had not war destroyed the finest young men that England could produce? Had it not wiped out a whole generation, leaving only the too old and the too young to struggle incompletely with the problems of peace?" Such were some of the ideas which affected many people in Britain in the 30s. Many people to whom the label of conscientious objector was repugnant after September 1939 had dallied in varying degrees with thoughts that war was stupid, horrible, and useless. Okay, so moving on to kind of what conscientious objectors were up to during the war. Following a tribunal, what percentage of COs were, 1, granted unconditional exemption and could continue with their normal lives, 2, granted conditional exemption and directed to agricultural or ambulance work, or 3, completely dismissed and were forced to join the armed forces, find another way out, or were jailed? What do we reckon? Any guessing with the percentages?
30, 30, 30.
30, 30, 30?
Well, 33.
Yeah. 30, 30.
More of 2 and 3.
Mm.
I'd say maybe 2 had the most, sort of like
Mm.
10, 80, 10.
Yeah, yeah, okay. So we've got 5% granted unconditional exemption, 70% granted conditional exemption, and 25% completely dismissed.
Yeah.
So what about those that got non-combatant service?
So we're in the non-combatant corps.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think they're being, sorry, how do I go back? Oh, there we go. I think that would be granted as conditional exemption. So that's another, yeah, so they'd be directed to basically be in the army, but in the non-combatant corps. Yeah.
So I know somebody who was in bomb disposal.
Yeah, yeah. So that people have varying degrees of what they thought was kind of acceptable to themselves. So, you know, some people were willing to kind of join the army in that corps, as long as they didn't have to wield weapons. But for some people, obviously, that was unthinkable. So, yeah. Okay, so who said this? The rights which have been granted in this war and the last to conscientious objectors are a definite part of British policy. Anything in the nature of persecution, victimisation, or manhunting is odious to the British people. Any guesses?
Winston Churchill.
Yes, it is Winston Churchill, which I think some people might be surprised by.
Yeah.
So I would say the popular narrative of the Second World War should actually include conscientious objection. Tobias Gillier said, throughout the Second World War, the legal protection of conscientious objectors came to be seen as part of the moral distinction between British liberal democracy and fascism. If the war was said to be just, it was partly because the Allies left space for freedom of conscience. For people like Churchill, they might have strongly disagreed with the positions taken by conscientious objectors, but they also saw the right to take such positions as a key part of British traditions of liberty and justice.
But only in the United Kingdom and the rest of the
Yeah,
empire.
yeah.
It was a completely different
Yeah,
story.
exactly.
So there's a,
Yeah. Good point, very good point. Okay, so I'm on to the second section here, and what I would say is that I'm not an expert in children's literature. So this is a project I'm working on with my mother, who she just retired, but she did run the MA in children's literature at Goldsmiths University, and so we kind of are marrying up our two research interests with this project. So so I'll take you through it anyway. Yes, I'm not a literature expert. So children's literature about Second World War conscientious objectors. Children's books about war published in the UK have become increasingly popular since the turn of the century, offering a progressively more realistic treatment to the extent that there is now commonplace subject matter. Wars within living memory have inspired the largest volume of children's fiction, with particular interest in the two world wars. Literature is a key way in which children can learn about war. However, little has been written that about, a little has been written that confronts issues of peace, pacifism, and resistance to war for children, especially concerning conscientious objectors. So this is the approach of our project. We began our study by extensive scoping in the field of UK children's literature to identify books which focused on our chosen themes of peace, pacifism, and war resistance. We compiled a list of 13 books, which I've listed at the side there, which address the subject to some extent from as far back as 1967, including picture books, middle grade, young adult books, and poetry collections that fitted our requirements. This demonstrates how starkly how little has been written on the topic of pacifism, if you think about the kind of time span of these being published. We read all the books in question to achieve an overview of the field, and then selected 5 middle grade young adult books recently published in the UK, 2 that focused on the First and 3 on the Second World War. But for this presentation, I'll be speaking about the 3 books that we selected that deal with pacifism and conscientious objection in the Second World War. So just 3 books. So, as Agnew notes, conscientious objection is a subject rarely covered in children's books, perhaps because the prevailing ethos of children's literature, particularly British literature of the Second World War, still veers towards a version of history which gives the Allied troops the moral high ground, and which ignores the civilian deaths and terrible damage inflicted by the British forces. So again, that's coming back to the popular memory of the war in Britain. So the key question we're focusing on is, when it is covered, how is conscientious objection represented in children's literature? So these are the 3 books. Run, Rabbit, Run, published in 2015 by Barbara Mitchell-Hill. Klaus, Vogel and the Bad Lads, 2013 by David Almond. In the Mouth of the Wolf, 2018 by Michael Morpurgo. So we've got some quite famous authors there. So, research questions. How is conscientious objection presented in the text? What explanations for pacifism are given? Does the book promote an anti-war perspective? So the first book, sorry, a bit of a long, but this is just an outline of the book, and it's quite eventful. So, Run, Rabbit, Run focuses on a family from Rochdale, Lancashire. It tells the story of 2 children, Lizzie and Freddie, who have to go on the run after their father's appeal for conscientious objector status is rejected. He is threatened with prison if he does not enlist, but decides that leaving is the only way to keep the family together. 2 months before the opening of the story, Freddie and Lizzie's mum was killed by a bomb which fell on her shop. Dad decides that they are going to move to White Way Colony, an alternative community in Gloucestershire founded by a Quaker and still in existence today. Initially, Lizzie enjoys White Way, but it soon becomes impossible for them to stay there, and the family goes on the run again, this time to a farm, working alongside 2 kind land girls and a very cruel farmer. The farmer eventually calls the police on Lizzie's dad. Once again, the Butterworth family is forced to run, but when Freddie gets sick, they must seek help and a doctor is called. The doctor is required to report Dad to the police, and this time he decides to give himself up when they come for him. While Dad is in prison, Lizzie and Freddie are evacuated to South Wales. I've identified some key excerpts for you to have a read of, and then maybe we can, have some of your thoughts about these. I've got them printed out for people in the room if it's easier. Okay, if you've had a chance to read them, can we have any thoughts that occurred to people whilst reading?
It's a great story.
Mm-hmm.
I think the 2 excerpts work so well together, Rosie, so thank you for putting them together.
That's okay.
Do they speak to each other in that way in the book?
Yeah, so I suppose if you look at the page numbers, one's from right at the beginning, so it's kind of an introduction to the whole situation, and the second's much later on. I think it's right at the end. So it's yeah, I thought they were quite interesting put together. I've put some notes of, regarding the research questions. I made some notes about this. So how is the conscientious objector presented? So they're presented as brave for standing up for their beliefs. what explanations for pacifism are given? There's no explicit reason for personal connection to pacifism given. Lizzie, the child narrator, gives an objective reason for our father's beliefs when challenged in the playground. A conscientious objector doesn't believe in killing people. They don't believe it's right to go to war. So, you know, it's quite basic, but maybe easy for a child to understand. Does the book promote an anti-war perspective? Well, the message is far from clear, but serves more to problematise and question assumptions about the efficacy of war. And here's a quote from the author. I was in email contact with her, and she said, "The question of conscientious objection," that's a picture of her as well, "is a difficult one for me, as I can understand both sides of the argument. The reason I wrote Run, Rabbit, Run was that I didn't find any other books written for the 9 to 13 age group on this subject." So she's kind of distancing herself slightly. So something we might want to talk about later. Right, the second book, Klaus, Vogel and the Bad Lads. The story is set a decade or two after the Second World War on Tyneside, where the author David Almond grew up. Fleeing persecution in his homeland, German refugee Klaus Vogel arrives in a small English town where the local gang take him under their wing. They call themselves the Bad Lads, but it's all mischief and harmless tricks, never any real trouble. They are led by Joe Gillespie, who's a year or two older. The lads initially thought that Joe was great, but there was a niggling feeling amongst one or two of the boys he was getting a bit more extreme, and that some of his pranks were actually deliberately going to hurt people. There's a fire at Mr. Eustace's, who had been a conscientious objector in the Second World War, which happens the same week that Klaus Vogel arrives. Klaus has the courage of his convictions and is prepared to stand up to Joe, which causes the narrator to reconsider his own involvement in the gang and also take a stand against bullying. So the conscientious objector here is a minor character, but the story slightly hinges around what happens with him. Here's some more quick excerpts.
It's pronounced Klaus Vogel and the Bad Lads.
Yes, apologies. Didn't know if it was appropriate for me to do the accent. Any thoughts about that?
I really like the line, he'd never find peace. It's so ironic, isn't it? That's all he wanted to do.
Yeah.
And he's never been able to find it in his own life because of what he's decided.
It's really interesting. Yeah, point.
Rosie, I was kind of struck by the sadness of that. Does the book overall leave you, or leave the reader feeling sad, or what would you say the kind of emotional journey is?
Yeah, I would say what happens at the end. I mean, I don't want to spoil the story, but I would say at the end there's a kind of reckoning, and Klaus Vogel and Mr. Eustace kind of form a bond, and it's left in a positive way. So yes, I would say this bit of the story is sad, but it gets better. Yeah.
So
sorry.
No, I know that Everett was talking about the second one, but I just do feel like there's something kind of insidious about the sort of the bit in the page 16 quote, which is like, my dad and the others went off to risk their lives fighting the Germans. But Mr. Eustace was like just sent to jail, and then they let him out to work on a farm. Like, it kind of feels like there's a subtext there as well about like lack of bravery. I don't know, maybe I'm misreading it, but like the idea that the risk their lives kind of seems like a dig at Mr. Eustace at the same time somehow.
Yeah, that's interesting. So what I kind of about how conscientious objection is presented, what I drew out is that they're portrayed as a persecuted group. However, the narrator is sympathetic to Mr. Eustace's plight. So again, it's like Run, Rabbit, Run, no explicit explanation of pacifism. It's just Mr. Eustace is simply against all war. He couldn't attack his fellow man. And does the book promote an anti-war perspective? Not explicitly. There are themes to do with social responsibility and the nature of freedom, which are seamlessly woven into the narrative, though. And Klaus Vogel, you know, standing up to bullies, that kind of thing. So it's a very interesting book, though, I think, that one. So last one, In the Mouth of the Wolf. It's the only text based on a true story. In the Mouth of the Wolf tells the wartime story of Michael Morpurgo's uncle Francis, who registered as a CO and joined a pacifist farming community. However, Francis, who narrates the story, suffers doubts when the true nature of the Nazi threat becomes apparent. He instead joins the French resistance as a secret agent, leading a terrifying life on the move behind enemy lines in occupied France and being a key player in its liberation. So here are the last excerpts.
You gave the age range for Run Rabbit Run. What are the age ranges for the other two books, including this one?
So they're meant to be kind of middle grade. So, I mean, this one, Michael Morpurgo said could be read from the age of 6, and that he was criticised for that, saying it was too grim. So, you know, I suppose that's a consideration. But it's got illustrations, it's got big text, so, you know, it's apparently directed towards a younger audience, but it deals with very big issues. So that's a photo of Michael Morpurgo's uncle, Francis Cammerts, who is quite famous. So Francis from In the Mouth of the Wolf has a relatively positive experience as a conscientious objector, joining a supportive pacifist farming community and meeting a like-minded woman whom he marries. This pleasant wartime experience makes him feel guilty, however. What explanations for pacifism are given? As we've seen in the excerpts, Francis provides historically specific reasons for his pacifist beliefs. This authenticity is likely due to the fact that this is a true story. And you might have kind of seen the parallels between the excerpts and the personal testimony I kind of went through earlier. Does the book promote an anti-war perspective? Not really. However, it raises questions about the morality of war. Ultimately, it feeds into the popular narrative of the Second World War, however, as Francis changes his mind and joins up. My research does actually suggest that a significant number of conscientious objectors did experience doubts and a sense of dilemma about their stand. Okay, so those are the books. Conclusion. So, an article in The Guardian in May 2014, reporting on the Peace Pledge Union's annual ceremony in London to mark International Conscientious Objectors Day, asked, "Where have all the conscientious objectors in literature gone?" Also commenting, "It would surely be good to hear more of that human story and to figure out why so little has been written about those martyrized and discomforted people." I should say, as a side note, there's not much adult literature about conscientious objectors either. I've found about 2 or 3 books. The books we have surveyed today are a useful introduction to the topic, but more are needed. Children's literature about conscientious objection can be used as a catalyst for wider discussions around peace, pacifism, and war resistance, both past and present. And so, yeah, I'll leave it there and move on to questions.
Okay, I'll go with a question, if you can hear me.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the resistance was also a kind of conscientious objection, only it was more actively participating in it. So how do you relate the two?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very interesting story, because you're right, he's not just kind of, oh, I will just go and join the army. He's fighting, but in a different manner, in a more kind of, yeah, outside the normal framework. So I think, yeah, you're right. It's not kind of completely renouncing his conscientious objection, in a sense.
So on that point, does it, I mean, is it, I'm just wondering whether like the kind of the common idea of a conscientious objector is somebody who is a pacifist, but maybe actually there's a wider terminology. So like somebody, you know, for example, who refuses to fight on behalf of a colonial power, but is anti-imperialist. I'm sort of like kind of playing devil's advocate as well here, but you know, like you could see how that would, like, you conscientiously object to fighting for the Queen and country and kind of fighting for Britain to keep hold of its colonies and stuff, but you actively want to fight against imperialism as part of a resistance somewhere. I don't know, is that like, or is that like, could that never be termed as conscientious objection, because ideally it's always from a pacifist perspective?
No, I agree. That's definitely true, and a lot of people, you know, base their attempt to become a conscientious objector on just, you know, an objection to a particular war rather than all war, you know, overall. Maybe something I should have clarified is that conscientious objection is like an identity conferred upon you by, or like by the state. So you have to apply to be a conscientious objector, register, and then you were formally granted, you know, conscientious objector status if you passed your tribunal and deemed genuine. So a lot of people who, you know, wanted to be conscientious objectors were rejected. So yeah, you're completely right. It doesn't. Not all conscientious objectors are pacifists at all.
But not all pacifists are passive. You know what I mean? You can be you can be a pacifist, but also and be active, an activist, but not necessarily you don't endorse violence.
Yeah.
So you know that. I mean, one of the phrases we use in the Peace-Based Union is pacifist, not passive. Sort of.
Yeah, I mean, if you think a lot of in the 30s, I didn't mention it because, you know, it wasn't time for everything, but a lot of people that wanted to become conscientious objectors were inspired by Gandhi and non-violent resistance. So yeah, completely, definitely.
So in World War I think it's 70 odd conscientious objectors died in prison and 31 went insane. Lloyd George said we need to make the pathway for a conscientious objector hard, and so that happened. So what was the treatment of conscientious objectors in World War II?
Yeah, I think it was much more tolerant. It wasn't as severe because, you know, as going back to that this is what we're fighting for, because we're this is a just war because we're a liberal democracy, and, you know, we don't treat people like that. We allow people to, you know, have their own conscience and that kind of thing. But actually, I think I found that was quite difficult for some people because they almost wanted to be treated like martyrs, or they wanted to be martyrized. And so actually having good treatment and being allowed to just go and work on a farm somewhere in a backwater or whatever was actually quite difficult sometimes for people to deal with. Yeah.
How dare you say Durham is a backwater?
Thank you, Rosie. I found it fascinating. I probably have some questions, but I think Phoebe's got her electronic hand up.
Yeah, I just, you know, different ways of resisting the war, because it like takes over everybody's lives. And it's interesting that it's the dads, the men. Yeah, but I'm just intrigued how women are portrayed as what influences they have. Anyway, it's a vast subject, but yeah, I kind of feel that there's just the basic matter of human rights about the war.
Well, the Second World War, some women were called up, so they were could become conscientious objectors, and I think there were about 1,000 or so. But that's an area that really needs a lot of work, because not much is known about it at all. But yeah, so obviously there were a lot of women that were equally kind of as pacifist as anti-war as the men, but they didn't have as much chance to kind of show it kind of openly. Yeah.
So in World War I, women ran the fellowship of, I forget it, that supported conscientious objectors.
The non-conscription fellowship.
Yeah. So what did women do in World War II that supported conscientious objectors?
So they weren't actually allowed to join the Peace Pledge Union initially. I think it was a couple of years later. So yeah, it was founded in 1934,
Yes.
and then 1936 women could join. So they obviously joined then. There was a central board for conscientious objectors that helped out, helped support conscientious objectors, help them with all the information they needed. Sometimes they help people practice for their tribunals and that kind of thing, and visiting people in prison, that kind of thing. So women were really active in that as well. So there were kind of a few ways they could be involved.
So is the line in your family, you, your mum, and then your granddad?
Yeah.
That's very interesting.
Yeah, definitely. One of my chapters is going to be about the legacy and about kind of pacifism or radicalism being handed down through the family. Yeah.
Rosie, can I ask?
Yeah.
I think obviously most of us would probably like these sorts of books and some of these alternative sort of narratives, even if they're not as radical as we might always like to be featuring in the classroom, because as you say, it's one very kind of dominant narrative. How far would you say these books do go in kind of presenting an alternative narrative, or do you feel it's a bit weak? Because you were kind of asking how anti-war are they, or what's the evidence, what are the reasons being given for conscientious objection?
I think it'd be nice to have a book that really promotes an anti-war perspective, because I don't think any of them do entirely. So that would be good. I think they're definitely useful to read, and they spark of debate. And I think you got an email from a lady who wanted to have those discussions with her granddaughter and couldn't find any resources. So yeah, I think they can be useful, but I definitely think just more is needed, basically. And sometimes there's only one there where the conscientious objector features very, very heavily and is and is a contributor to the entire book. So yeah, I just think variety is needed and some more book promoting an anti-war perspective if possible.
Can I say something, Rosie? Oh no, is he going to say something else? No, okay. Thanks so much, Rosie. It's brilliant. And I just wanted to say how helpful it was. Just that quote from Run Rabbit Run about say that in plain English. I think that just really sums up how this being a conscientious objector or being a peace educator is complicated. It's so complex. You want to. Hans and I just got into this. We were trying to write a blog, and we wanted to say something that we hold to be true. That peace is the answer. Peace is our natural state. And then thinking, no, in a world that accepts war as normal, actually it's complex, and you've got to sort of set your stall out a bit if you're not just with people who are on board with it. So I thought that was really brilliant. I think these excerpts are so useful to use in classrooms and groups. Good. Yeah, thank you. When you go against the grain, whether it's critical thinking or pacifism, what we're all sharing here, it's just complicated because the language isn't there, the grammar isn't there, the context. And the challenge is making it accessible and not feeling like what's going on in Run Rabbit Run. Well, that sounds pretentious. That sounds like you're trying to pull the wool over my eyes with long words. Wider-ish definitely brings in wider issues, doesn't it?
Of which Phoebe has asked if the slides can be shared at all.
Yeah, sure, that's fine. Yeah, I'm happy for that.
Thank you, Rosie. It's really true.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I was just wondering whether Jane could possibly say something about because Jane, you've introduced kind of the stories of conscientious objection, haven't you? And kind of in terms of calling it Welsh peace heritage to your peace schools in Wales. And I was there when a group of Jane's students reenacted a tribunal, and that was fascinating because they got so into the roles. We filmed a bit of that. It's in one of our short films about peace education. But I just wonder whether Jane wanted to say anything about how that's also a way of telling a different narrative, getting the students to kind of explore the local history and act it out?
Yeah, that was particularly relevant to those students because they were looking at people, I think it was in the Merthyr in the South Wales area, that were involved as conscientious objectors. I mean, we did a lot of that work during the Wales for Peace project, which was during the centenary of World War I. Of course, the money's run out for that now, but the problem hasn't gone away, has it, really? I think that was partly about helping them to, because they also asked questions, they visited their local war memorial and asked questions about that. So part of it is just that critical thinking, isn't it? And then understanding a real life perspective of somebody that made that choice. It's interesting that some of the things that influenced that, certainly in South Wales, and I guess this is Britain as well, maybe no longer so strong. So one of the things was the chapels, and the chapels were very much about, you know, people not wanting to kill, and of course they've declined. And then the other strand was about, you know, solidarity with international workers. So there was that international socialism. So those were the two main strands, really, of people who wanted to be conscientious objectors. And, you know, you ask then, so what would it be in our modern society that would make people make that stance? It's quite interesting.
Helen has got her hand up.
Hello.
Thank you. Yeah, mine was really just a sort of a practical thought, because I was thinking, linking that to our sort of proposal for putting together a parents' families pack, and that list of books was really, really useful. So having that as a resource as well, books for children.
Jane, go for it.
Sorry, just to say that I don't think there are many left, but there are some places where there are records of the tribunals that were held with conscientious objectors. So if you can get hold of those, that really puts the story across about what was behind. The National Library of Wales have got quite a lot, and they've put that into a pack which is available for schools, so you can actually look at the actual records. There must be at least one local authority in Wales where in England where they weren't destroyed as well. A lot of them were destroyed.
Yeah, they were all destroyed apart from one tribunal in Middlesbrough, I thought, because people thought, yeah, they thought they wouldn't be of interest to people, or, you know, weren't important to keep. So there's not that many. I think the Peace Pledge Union has collected quite a few kind of people's speeches to the tribunal.
If you go onto the PPU website, and you can go onto the men who said no, and there's biographies of quite a lot of the conscientious objectors, and you can use those as case studies. I used to do something in schools where I would go in and have a case study of a Victoria Cross winner, and also a case study of a conscientious objector, and I'd get them to look at these and discuss who was the real hero. And very often, you know, there would be a positive approach. I mean, I wouldn't go in and it was just bringing in a different view that they'd never heard of.
That's it.
And they were quite taken aback, really, kids. You know.
Could I just welcome Deborah? Thank you for joining us. I'm not sure how much of Rosie's presentation you caught. Deborah contacted me recently. Rosie just referred to. I don't know whether you'd like to just very briefly share your story, Deborah, about your granddaughter.
Yeah, thank you. I had been on a phone call. I couldn't stop, but as it happened, I arrived just at the beginning of Rosie's presentation, so it's perfect. Thank you. Yeah, I was interested because our granddaughter, who is 10, has recently visited a World War II prison camp, which is now a sort of visitor attraction, and they've been thinking about the Second World War in school, and the teacher was
mainly talking about her personal, when she was talking about personal experience, it was about munitions factories and the sort of drama of the Blitz and that sort of thing. And so I just thought it would be helpful to have something to think about, another way of thinking about war. And in fact, I was very grateful for your recommending, or through Rosie, recommending Run Rabbit Run, which I've already ordered. So it's going to be ready for half term. Thanks. And it's been a useful discussion too. Thank you.
Thank you, Deborah, because you mentioned that your granddaughter was almost kind of enamoured with the stories of the Blitz, and I think this is the danger, isn't it? That it can be kind of romanticised,
yeah,
or glorified. We've also got our conscience and conviction resources produced some time ago, but I think they're probably still fairly useful. I've just put the link to Conscience in the chat, and there's also Conviction, and that's a series of stories about of kind of real life stories of people that made different decisions. Yeah. Okay, well, shall we say a very big thank you to Rosie? Thanks so much for sharing. If anyone wants to put any other comments for Rosie, what they found useful or helpful in the chat, if that's useful for Rosie, or just to really say we appreciate that. I think it's given loads of food for thought for sharing with school, thinking about how we can share with parents, grandparents, and others. And also, if there's anyone out there, budding writers, we obviously need more literature in this area. Rosie has made that clear. So thank you so much.